Hello everybody, welcome back to the Armchair Ace. I'm taking a class on compassion in my college, and it's an interesting class. And I'm learning a lot about self-compassion, self-sacrifice, different mentalities that you can have for not just for other people, but also yourself, as self-compassion is important to have. We were all tasked with doing some kind of final project that talks about compassion, and of course I decided to talk about compassion through the lens of aviation history, which is... I asked if I could do it, and my professor said yeah, so I'm just gonna run with it. I've already done all the filming, even though it's due in, weeks from now. But I had fun filming, and I was able to take some of my camera gear to the Hill Aerospace Museum and film a little mini documentary. Not as an endorsement, I wasn't really paid to be at the Air Museum, which, by the way, is Air Force property. But it was cool. I was able to stand next to the F-4 Phantom that they had there, the F-4C that was on display. Which, one of the stories that I told, which was about self-sacrifice, was a very famous story that I kind of wanted to retell because I've just been thinking about self-sacrifice. There's an article that I read by Anita Owusu that talks about the double-edged sword of self-sacrifice. It's definitely a noble act, but if you're not careful, it can get you and the person that you're trying to help, if there is a second person in the picture, or multiple people that you're trying to help, into a dire set of circumstances that you didn't even consider, or think were worth thinking about, basically. But sometimes it's the only option that you have, so you might as well do it. And that was what I brought up when I was introducing the story of Pardo's Push, which was one of the most famous aerial gambles of 1967 during the Vietnam Air War. I basically recounted the events of what happened during Pardo's Push, which I guess I'll reiterate here. So, Earl Amon and Bob Pardo were F-4 pilots, and they were flying with their backseaters. I don't know if they're called Rios, or I'm just gonna say Rios, but yeah, they did have backseaters because they were flying the C model. So Earl Amon and Bob Pardo were flying on the sorties over enemy territory. Earl Amon's fuel tank was shot up, and he was running out of fuel very quickly. They would have tried to go to the aerial refueling tanker, but they just weren't gonna make it. So Amon tried climbing up to around 38,000 feet so that he could extend his glide range, but that wasn't going to be enough to get him out of enemy territory. And Bob Pardo was doing some thinking of how he could get Amon and Amon's backseater out of that situation, because if they were to eject, the likelihood was very high that they would have been captured by the Viet Cong and they would never be seen again. So Pardo positioned his own F-4 behind Amon's. They brainstormed through a few different potential solutions, and then they eventually landed on something. And that was having Amon shut down his engines, extend his tailhook, and Pardo would push his F-4 right up against the tailhook, having that hook propped right up against the windshield, the windscreen. And once that was done, Pardo would power up his engines and push both F-4s out of enemy territory. And that's quite the image. And there were a lot of problems with this. Pardo's F-4 ended up slipping around a lot, so he had to reposition himself and reattach the F-4 to the tailhook. There was nothing really holding them together because Pardo was actively pushing against that tailhook. One of Pardo's engines actually caught fire, but he was luckily able to put out the fire and restart the engine, and then it immediately caught fire again. So it was quite the pickle, but they were able to get back to Allied lines. Pardo didn't really have enough fuel to get to the tanker either, so both planes, all 4 crew members ejected and they were rescued. The crew were all interviewed. Eamon asked Pardo, "Why would you do such a thing? Why would you help me in such a dire situation like this?" And Pardo said, "I don't have an answer. I just couldn't leave you behind." And I think that's just a cool moment of humanity and just people's selflessness. They put their own risk aside and express their compassion for another person by, bringing them out of a really dire situation. There are other instances that I mentioned in the little mini documentary, like the Ye Olde Pub Escort and the Hap Halloran and Hadaichi Kaiho encounter in the Pacific War. I hope I'm saying their names right, but yeah, those are a couple of other instances that I bring up that have happened historically. But the Bob Pardo story was the very specific self-sacrifice instance that I brought up. Now, let me reiterate again that you definitely do need to be careful in terms of self-sacrifice, as you don't want to put yourself into a situation where you put yourself in a greater danger than you would have intended, or another person. And things you can do: consider the variables, consider your environment, regardless of whether it's a grand act or something that is very personal to you, like an important decision, whether it revolves around a career or college path. If you have to take anything away from what I have to say there and my own advice on self-sacrifice on behalf of yourself or someone else, let me quote Bob on this specifically. "I wouldn't have done it or suggested it if I didn't think I could do it." So yeah, I just figured that was cool to share. I've been thinking about that a lot, so I figured I'd just talk about it here. So hope you found this interesting. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you again very soon.